I really enjoy the narrative side of playing games like Warhammer 40k. You might not think that's the case, seeing as I talk about my journey into the competitive scene, my defense of L-shaped ruins, or my assertion that it's okay to be grey. I can assure you that this title is not meant to be here as rage bait. Mostly. Okay, it is a little bit, but look, I'm making a video on the internet. I'm gonna make you click somehow. I imagine there's not an insignificant number of people who are ready to throw hands in the comments for simply implying that there are problems with narrative 40k. As much as I enjoy that side of the hobby, I do think there are some issues, and I have some ideas on how to fix them. It isn't really a huge fix either, and a lot of it is really down to the perception of what people think of when they hear the word narrative, and trying to ensure that all aspects of narrative can be appreciated and experienced more effectively. The strangest part of all this is there's nothing that's really been done wrong by anyone. Both the players and Games Workshop make narrative what it is, and nothing that has been done has caused these problems to appear. Not really, anyway. Even if you think GW caters to competitive players more, they still release Crusade rules, and their latest card decks have these fluffy twists and asymmetric deployments that aren't meant to be used in tournaments. GW is balancing the game more often, which does cater to competitive players. That might make some narrative players exclaim that by making it balanced, the game becomes less narrative, but I don't believe that's the case. I'll explore this more later on, but GW does cater to a certain type of style with their rules, but it isn't competitive. Oh, Paul, how are you going to justify that one? The players are definitely not to blame, and I wouldn't even entertain the idea of saying that the problem with narrative is player-based. However, I do think there are things that the players can do to make narrative better for themselves and each other. I'm not just talking about narrative players here either, I'm talking about all of us. Every player of 40k, from the most whimsical weaver of epic fables to the most hardened mastermind of top tables. If there was something to blame, it would be the game of 40k itself, but to call it blame would be a gross exaggeration. It's not 40k, it's the nature of the kind of game 40k is. Alright, now that I've spent 2 minutes digging myself a gigantic hole with this intro, it's time for me to dig up and explain myself. Strap in, this ended up being a lot longer than I thought it would be. Warhammer 40k is a massive hobby that encompasses multiple different aspects that resonate with many different people, from the lore to the modeling and painting to the game itself. And within the game, you have people that bring their own ideas of what the game is, how it should be played, and how other people who disagree with them are ruining everything. There are many words that are used to describe the types of way that 40k is experienced: casual, competitive, narrative, match play, crusade, beer and pretzels, tournaments, and these words get thrown around somewhat consistently, but without any proper definitions. So you can get questions like, does casual always equate to narrative? If someone is playing a standard terrain layout and trying to play fairly sensible lists, but aren't looking to go to tournaments and just like playing standard games versus friends and take all afternoon to play, is that competitive or is that casual? If someone writes a long narrative reason to fight and then plays a hyper-competitive game to determine the winner because they want a balanced game to determine the outcome of their story, is that narrative or is that competitive? If I'm chilling and joking and me and my opponent are making plays that are funny and cool rather than logical at a tournament, is that still competitive or has that become casual? If I serve beer and provide snacks to the top tables in round 5 of a grand tournament, does that make it a casual game suddenly? These kinds of questions blur the lines between the types of ways people interact with Warhammer and other tabletop games. I've played games in tournaments where the game changes to be more narrative based on the things happening during the game. Normally it's based on me losing the game and having to start my own objectives like hunting down and killing the lion. I have units in my army that have certain fluffy characteristics that grow across the tournament based on dice rolls, like my Assault Centurions always charging high and Shrike always missing twice with his melee attacks. I've played games that are very standard, which has led to epic stories being told, and I've played Crusade games on tournament layouts to help keep things balanced to ensure the game stays fun without having to be expert game designers. To help things make sense, I'd like to propose some more defined definitions for the way 40k is played, or at least pin down the ways I'm going to talk about for this discussion so we're all on the same page. The words that I think most people expect are things like casual, competitive, narrative, and competitive again. But I think those words are misleading. I think the words casual, competitive, and narrative describe the mindsets of the people playing the game, not the way the actual game is being played. What the fuck does that mean? Okay, I think the way that we play the game should be described differently, so I'd like to change the narrative, of what we're talking about here. I'm going to use the words relaxed, formal, strategic, and cinematic. Now, these are not black and white definitions, but are labels that go onto a scale, and people can be anywhere along the spectrum of these two axes, which defines their preferred way to play. Due to the fact that I'm a fucking loser who likes to create graphs to help understand how humans work, we can take these two scales and arrange them like this to create what I have called called the System for Quantifying Unique Individual Game Styles. The X-axis describes how closely you adhere to the standardized rules to make a balanced game and how rigid your adherence to the rules are. It might be tempting to consider relaxed as newer players or more for fun games and formal for tournament and competitive play. I've specifically not used the word competitive as an opposition to relaxed because you can be a new player and still want to play the game that sticks to the core rules to help understand and learn it better. That makes it a more formal experience. On the other end, a tournament event could have some silly gimmick that makes it more relaxed and casual, even if it caters to seasoned players. Relaxed avoids the word casual, which could be interpreted to mean new or infrequent or uninvested. Instead, relaxed describes the approach to the rules of 40k. You can have a casual game that is highly strategic and formal, for example, because you're playing in a casual environment. Casual in this case is your mindset going into what could potentially be a highly strategic game. The y-axis is a measure of what you value more as you play the game. Strategic players are more concerned with the best ways to outmaneuver their opponents, while cinematic players are more fixated on telling the best stories through gameplay, making decisions that make for more cool moments, even if they aren't exactly the best idea logically. Cinematic could also denote the spectacle side of the hobby. Strategic players are likely more okay with grey L's and unpainted minis and are more focused on playing the game optimally, and cinematic players value nicely painted models and epic battlefields that encompass a wide variety of different scenarios. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it might be more likely, but I wouldn't have that as one of the main tenets of a cinematic style of game. Someone who is more focused on cinematic moments doesn't have to necessarily be the best painter or have an abundance of different terrain. Grey models on Grey City ruins can tell gripping stories with enough imagination and true storytelling, and a thematic battlefield could be played as strategically as the top tables of a super major if that's what you want to do. By splitting out these two disciplines and putting them on a scale, we can better define the ways people interact with the game. This more fluid approach can allow us as individuals to find the things that we gravitate towards, but there are sections which will appeal to certain types of players and styles. Competitive tournaments, for example, would be more weighted towards this quadrant, which has a closer adherence to the standardized rules and strategic play, but still some leeway for moving forward towards cinematic moments and bending the rules in small ways. Most people at tournaments are fine with you turning a model around so you can be face to face with your attacker in melee, because it just looks cool, despite there being the potential that rotating a model might give you a minuscule advantage later on. I've done it, my opponents have done it. It's a small thing that helps keep the game from getting too serious, and people like to see that cinematic character one-on-one happen even at tournaments. Pretty much every player I've played against has been happy to do takebacks if you missed something, and will help remind you of things that you'd need to know to make the best strategic decisions. Not many people are going to hit you with the Codex Astartes does not support that action, because that doesn't make it a proper test of skill if your opponent makes a move based on false pretenses. Your friendly game with a friend where you just want to hang out and roll some dice are beer and pretzels kind of games. The ones that take all afternoon, you're playing slow, and it's more of a backdrop to just hanging out and catching up with your mates, because you've got adult responsibilities and finding a spare day that you're both free are few and far between these days. Those go in this quadrant. Maybe your battlefield is less standard because you're scrounging together a bunch of junk from around the room, or maybe you aren't fully up to date on all the myriad rules changes, but you're still playing 40k strategically rather than trying to tell a story. Epic moments can happen, but that'd be down to the dice rather than an explicit effort to weave a tale. Crusade games I'd put in this quadrant, which might seem strange, but Crusade has a lot of rules and bookkeeping that requires a more formal approach to the narrative experience. You have the freedom to tell whatever story you want in your overarching narrative. You can name your minis and your units whatever you like, but your army and missions are structured through the Codex Crusade rules and the Crusade books. And this final quadrant is the brewery. This is where you're diverging from the rules and creating your own missions using crazy terrain layouts, maybe even custom homebrewed rules and units in an attempt to craft weird and wonderful stories to show off your extremely fluffy armies. The further towards the corner of this quadrant you get determines how far removed from the standard 40k experience you're willing to go. Now, these quadrants aren't meant to be rigid definitions, but serve as a decent guideline. There is no right way to... No, that's... I've completely done a terrible thing with my script there. No, try that again. There is no wrong way to play, so let me know in the comments where you think you are on this chart. I think I'm around here-ish. It might not be a single point, but a range of points. Maybe you just cover the entire bloody graph because you just simply enjoy everything. I don't know. Just let me know so I can get some early engagement for the algorithm. Okay, that is a lot of setup, and you might be thinking that if there are problems with narrative, they can be solved by having more support for this quadrant of playstyle from Games Workshop. However, this graph only tells part of the story. The way that this graph has been presented only scales to the bounds of what 40k can allow. What the hell does that mean? Wherever you are on this graph, at the end of the day, you have to still play 40k, and that has restrictions. As relaxed or narrative as you want to be, you can't Canadian destroy your opponent through the table while screaming because you decided there's an Inquisitor orbiting the planet you're fighting on. At that point, you're not playing 40k and should probably call a lawyer for the assault and property damage charges. The graph can extend beyond these limits, but be warned, as venturing beyond those limits will land you in the Forbidden Zone. If you go too relaxed, you end up just playing toy soldiers, moving stuff around and making pew-pew noises instead of rolling any dice. Venturing too far off the formal end of the scale, you enter the stinking grognard swamps, where every game takes 6 to 12 months to get through as you litigate over the definitions of every single word in a specific rule to determine that, unequivocally, rules as written, you should be allowed to use your cat as a dreadnought as long as the cat stays on the right base size. If you venture too far up the chart, you enter the cinematic highlands, where everything is letterbox. Helicopters and drones black out the sky, trying to get the best sweeping dramatic B-roll. And you end up writing a novel to justify why you're playing the game, whilst your friends actually just get on with playing the game, because they're fed up of waiting for you to write the law justification for bringing 12 Rogal Dawns stacked on top of each other. And by falling off the bottom of the graph, you leave reality and enter the Math Hammer Matrix, where you don't ever actually play a game of 40k, and instead try to create the mathematically best army, assuming that every dice roll is exactly average, and spend your time battling with spreadsheets instead of battling against actual people. So basically EVE Online. Therefore, it doesn't matter what kind of player you are or what kind of style of 40k you play. When it comes down to the basic fundamentals of what you're doing, you're still playing a game of 40k. And that restricts how much you can take your style of play in any of these directions before it becomes not 40k. A beer and pretzels hangout with your buddies kind of game of 40k is still relatively crunchy compared to other games that you might play while hanging out. 40k still requires some thought, and even if you aren't remembering all the rules properly, and maybe you're doing some silly lists, there's still a lot of setup in terms of writing the lists and getting terrain on the table. And you still have to play through the rounds much the same as someone going to a tournament would. That structure still applies, it's just much more of a relaxed pace. For cinematic games, even if you set up the most fantastic battlefield, have your wonderfully painted armies, have created a thematic mission together with your opponent to weave an epic tale of blood and bolter fire, you're still having to play within the structure of 40k. That terrain on that fantastic battlefield still has rules. Even if you made up your own mission, you set up sensible objectives that aren't just circles, you made lists that focus on story of your faction, and you may even act in more character for your army, you're still playing 40k. Going in any direction off this graph outside of the realms of 40k will lead to strange places, but the most common one that people probably understand most is if you go off this part of the graph. Going too far off the competitive deep end is where the arseholes you hear about on the internet appear, and although the chance of running into one of these people is greatly exaggerated, I believe, I am certain that they exist. I mean, of course they exist, and they can still ruin your 40k experience by pushing the game beyond a reasonable boundary of leniency and fun. These are what we call the win at all costs kind of players, or dickheads. If you run into one of these players, or there is a player in your local community that everyone is familiar with and tries to avoid, you have my permission to beat the shit out of them. Tell them to fuck off. Politely ask them to fuck off. Tell them to go buy Madcase 2.0 from tabletop.com. Whether you're a narrative player or a competitive player, you still need a way to bring your minis of any size to the table, and so you need to get yourself a Madcase 2.0 from Tabletop Stronghold. The adjustable trays allow you to fit both your meta list minis and your thematic list of nothing but Centurions. Your minis will remain safe and secure through the power of madness, which makes the Madcase 2.0 the most strategic and sensible way to transport your army, as well as being the most narrative, cinematic, and lore-accurate way. Yes, I am saying that the Madcase 2.0 is canon in whatever game system you play. Just try to prove me wrong. You can't. You also can't possibly resist the Independence Day sale for 30% off. And you can't not get free shipping to the USA, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and most of the EU. Did that make sense? So thank you again, Tabletop Stronghold, for sponsoring. Go to tabletopstronghold.com right now to get yourself a Madcase 2.0. Links in the description. And now it's time for another classic episode of All His Bad Stuff is winging it and needs to try and justify something he wrote before, because in the process of writing the script, he's thought about what he's saying more and found problems that needs to fix. Also known using the classic abbreviation Vivasi Anta Schwibit Pout Straw Smamf Fix. Rolls right off the tongue. I've realized at this point that I've made a bunch of assumptions, and I don't want to come off as creating a bunch of straw men to associate the opposing view to the side that I'm arguing for. There also may be some of you out there asking the very good question of, I like to play super narrative games with well-created tables and fully painted armies, and also want those games to be very strategic and follow the 40k rules closely. Where am I on the graph? And that's a decent question. Are you split across two ends of the scale of the graph? Does the graph wrap around? Do you just have multiple zones in which you have to associate? I don't know, but we'll work it out. Okay, so full disclaimer. This is my second time attempting this part of the video, as the concepts I'm trying to portray are actually kind of difficult to properly explain. So bear with me a moment. There are two things here I want to discuss. One is to ensure that I'm fully understanding the general sentiment of what people expect from Narrative 40k, and the other is to explain what the SQUIGS graph shows us if you're the kind of player who enjoys multiple aspects of the game. So let's deal with this first one. To make sure I know what people are thinking of and expecting when they hear Narrative 40k, I ask my viewers to let me know what they think. I should probably have done this for several previous videos, to be honest, but anyways, the answers I got were enlightening, but I don't think I read anything really unexpected. The main theme is storytelling, which, I mean, duh, yeah, obviously that's kind of what narrative means. Storytelling happens in many ways for narrative players, from moment-to-moment gameplay all the way to overarching grand narratives across many games. For narrative players during the game, the moment-to-moment decision-making is based less on wanting to win, but on wanting to tell the best story, making plays that are not necessarily the best optimal strategy, but are instead epic and heroic events that make sense in the context of the lore. A Space Marine captain charging alone into a demon prince to fight one-on-one is a good example. The game itself is not just missions from the chapter-approved card deck, but a specifically crafted mission with objectives that are key points in a narrative. A lot of comments mentioned specifically stuff like asymmetry being important, both in terms of win conditions and battlefield setups. Lists are also not meta lists, but instead are fluffy, fun lists that might not be the best, but are interesting and fun to play. And that single game is not just a single game in a vacuum, but part of a grand narrative that spans many games. The reason for an individual game to exist is because of decisions and outcomes from a previous game, and the results of that individual game change the next game you play. A Tyranid invasion attacks a Votann city. Votann winning means the next game has Votann on the offensive, pushing back the Tyranids. Tyranids winning means that the next game is Votann trying to re-establish a new base, defending it against the hive mind onslaught. There are also two other recurring ideals for Narrative 40k. These can be summarized as winning and losing is not the focus, and the game does not have to be balanced. These both feed into the narrative storytelling elements, but they are separate concepts that need to be evaluated later. Those concepts that I've just mentioned are where my problems with narrative arise. Or, I guess realistically, my problems with how narrative is perceived. Alright, I know it's been a long video, but wake up. We need to focus here because this is going to be tricky to navigate and explain properly. I'm also saying that more for myself rather than you, because if I say this wrong, I'm going to upset a lot of narrative players. And I know they can write very well, so the things they could say in the comments could be extremely cruel, well-written and poetic, but devastating to my ego. The overarching story, the reason for your armies to be fighting, and the moment-to-moment cinematic plays, I do not believe are exclusively narrative. There is a reason I chose the word cinematic instead of narrative on the SQUIGS chart to represent this kind of gameplay style. I also do not think that a narrative game requires being played cinematically, or playing for cool moments rather than proper tactics. I think you can have a narratively fulfilling game even using the chapter-approved mission cards on standard table layouts with meta lists and L-shaped ruins. I think that you can create unique and thrilling asymmetrical missions on a thematic battlefield with crazy rules, and then play the most strategic and formal game of 40k without any story at all. One comment I saw said, a narrative game lets us bend the rules for the sake of having a good time. I played one where we brought back scatter dice, gave everything deep strike, and then filled the board with terrain. It was very fun. Now, maybe I'm being blind, but I don't see a story being told. That just sounds like a fun game to play. I really do like digging holes for myself in this video, don't I? If I asked you to point to where on the SQUIGS chart you think Narrative 40k is, where would you point? I'm guessing probably around here, right? Maybe up here as well if you play Crusade and have that more formal bookkeeping approach, but regardless, probably close to the cinematic end of the scale. I believe the best area that represents narrative is here. The whole graph. No, this isn't me going mad again. Let me explain. Narrative isn't a way of playing 40k explicitly. Narrative is a mindset. Similarly, competitive is a mindset. This also allows us to quickly answer that second question I posed earlier. If you enjoy multiple elements of 40k, where do you sit on the SQUIGS graph? The answer is that you likely sit here, slap bang in the middle. I believe that 40k as a game is designed for this area of the SQUIGS chart, the pivot point between all four elements. A game that has formal rules people can follow, but with leniency due to the complexity of the game and it still being a social experience where you're looking to have fun. A game that is strategic, but with dramatic flares through the back and forth nature of it being a war game, where heroes are created and destroyed through quick thinking, risk-taking, or just pure luck of the dice. And I think that this area of the graph represents the best place for an overall experience in narrative, competitive, and casual environments based on how 40k is designed. The difference between those three experiences is the mindset you and your opponents bring to the table. If you go to a tournament with a narrative mindset, you're going to have a bad time. If you join a crusade with a competitive mindset, you're going to have a bad time. When different mindsets collide, that's when you have problems. And I think that is what causes a lot of arguments between certain players, because they think that their mindset equates to this area of the graph and the other mindsets shift it away from that perfect balance point. Now, this is the point I didn't make clear the first time I tried this, but I want to really drive this home. When I say perfect balance point, I'm talking about the perfect balance point that 40k as a game is created to handle out of the box. Crusade rules shift things towards this quadrant, the tournament companion shifts things this way, and the more unconventional missions from White Dwarfs or your own homebrew missions moves it this way. The way you play is not imperfect, but it's a result of deviating from the core standard rules that 40k is made around. Okay, so I wanted to lay that groundwork so I can make yet another potentially controversial statement, because I can't help myself and try to reach Earth's core with these takes. This one is probably going to be the hottest one, but here goes. I don't think storytelling requires a narrative game, and a narrative game has nothing to do with storytelling at all. Whoa, here we go. Let's try and justify this one. This is where the video goes from being a fairly standard length to being far too long. It's because this concept I really just went in circles originally and tried to find the answer to what true narrative games entail or what narrative truly means. So let's pull out the concept of storytelling and put it on its own for a second. During my games at tournaments, I've had times where cinematic things have happened, and sometimes me and my opponent are just having a fun little exchange where we describe a story happening based on events that have occurred. I've also made the most optimal play or taken a risk on a high dice roll which ended up turning the game, which makes for an epic moment and tells a gripping story. My streaming Ravens have an overarching lore built based on the games that I've played and the exploits they've had at these events. Some of my models and units have stories that have carried forward to future tournament games, and this all happened organically through the medium of playing 40k without even trying to have a narrative mindset. I've been weaving a narrative that has been built up with the competitive mindset, and storytelling has happened either retroactively or in my own head. But these were not narrative games. I was not playing narrative 40k, but I am telling a story. The dice are dictating where that story goes, which also happens in narrative play, and I'm fitting together the pieces of an overarching lore for my custom chapter through my tournament events. People describe their epic plays from tournament games with the same energy and cinematic flair as any narrative exploit. That captain that killed a demon prince may have been due to you thinking it was the most narrative thing to do, or it could have been a calculated risk to claw back a victory in a competitive game. The story is the same, and the competitive player might even have named their captain to make the story feel more immersive. So what is narrative 40k? Are we saying that people who just want to tell a story even in their more formal games aren't playing narrative 40k? Does it really have a requirement to not use meta lists and standard mission packs? There is a difference between narrative 40k and what I'm doing with my Screaming Ravens. Let me display the quotes from my script that I've just said. What do you think the key distinction in this quote is that makes this not a fully narrative experience? Now let me highlight some of the words for you. The games that I am playing are not narrative 40k games. My mindset is competitive with some narrative elements, but my opponent's is pure competitive. I can tell a story perfectly fine, but we aren't playing narrative 40k explicitly. There is a difference between playing 40k and telling a story versus playing 40k in order to tell a story. You can't do the second one unless both players at the table have the same mindset. This is why I think you can tell stories without narrative 40k, but in order to play a game of what can be considered narrative 40k, you and your opponent must have that same mindset going into it, and that's where those other elements people mentioned come in. Not focusing on winning or losing, a game being potentially unbalanced, that kind of thing. If both players are narratively focused, you aren't telling stories based on what happened in a balanced game where you're trying to win, but instead you're trying to tell a story by making actions to facilitate it explicitly. And that only works if both players are doing it, otherwise you get that clash which causes problems. I wanted to make a joke here by saying something like, there's no I in collaborative storytelling, but I realized I may have accidentally stumbled into an actual message within these words that really sums up the core issues that I have with narrative 40k. There are two I's in narrative storytelling. What the fuck does that mean? I really want to challenge some of the default ideas that go into narrative 40k mindset. Stuff like the winning and losing isn't important concept. Right, so I get the sentiment. You aren't tryharding or playing with meta lists. The important thing is making narrative sense and playing for epic moments. But you are still trying to win, right? You are still playing a game of 40k. Your Votan are still trying to defend and repel the attack from the Tyranid Swarm, because if you aren't trying to win, what are you doing? Why are you playing the game at all? Sure, the outcome of the game, whether you hold the line or not, isn't important, but both you and your opponent have a win condition. If you have a win condition, you are trying to win. The way your units will behave during the game will likely be the most optimal strategy to ensure that they do not get eaten alive by a hungry swarm of bugs. Whether you're able to do that or not is a separate question, and in narrative, the answer to that question is engaging regardless of the answer, as opposed to a competitive mindset where you are trying to win, and so winning is better than losing. I want to reiterate that this exact game of Votann defending against Tyranids can be played completely non-narratively. Maybe you and a friend just have those armies and want to play a siege type game, but you aren't thinking at all about the story. You just want to have a fun game that's a bit different. Cool things might happen during the game, but that's just a side effect of 40k being the kind of game 40k is. Either way, you aren't going to throw the game because you don't care about winning or losing. You need to hold this base, otherwise the Tyranids will kill you and your kin. You need to win to ensure the future of your people, so you are going to try your best to make that happen. Now, that might not necessarily be true. Maybe you've created a game where the Tyranids will overrun the Votann eventually. Maybe you have constant swarm over and over again until the Votann die, and the game is about holding out for as long as possible. That is very cool and makes sense, but I don't really think that means you don't mind losing, because from the outset, you and your opponent have made it clear that your win condition isn't hold the base, it's survive as long as possible. And you might satisfy that win condition by lasting a large number of rounds, even if the end of the game counts as you losing. If you're playing a narrative game where you both have a win condition, you are trying to win. You still have to think strategically, and you're still confined by the rules of 40k. Even with a lot of custom elements, the phases are the same as a regular game, the data sheets have the same stats, the dice mean the same thing, etc, etc. Some people mentioned that they will ignore rules or bend the rules slightly or change up some of their custom stuff mid-game to ensure better narrative flow, and that is really cool, but I feel like the more you do that, the further from 40k you get. And if you go too far, you risk playing a game that's so far removed from 40k, you're instead just writing a story with visual diagrams. You lose a lot of emergent narrative if you don't let the decision making of the players and the dice results tell at least some of the narrative. Also, the outcome might not matter, but losing repeatedly has the potential to simply just not be fun, even if it is part of the narrative. There are two eyes, and you both want to tell an epic story and have epic moments for your side of the story. People don't really tell stories that are like, yes, this one super epic campaign I got to play, I got the shit kicked out of me over and over again. My units did nothing, and the enemy characters was the coolest guy ever. My guy was useless. The stories people tell are the stories of when they did something amazing, and to do that, it doesn't necessarily require you to win, but it does require that you try to win, because this is a 1v1 PvP game, which brings us to the other statement I want to challenge. Narrative is unbalanced. I've heard this many times, and in fact, I've said it in previous videos, that if you go into a narrative game, you should expect it to be unbalanced. I reject this notion. I used to think it, but now I believe that this is a very poor statement that does more harm than good. I don't think this is a malicious statement, but I do think it is a badly worded one. I want to change the statement to be more fitting to what people actually mean, because unbalanced games are not fun, and that unbalance can manifest in many ways. Asymmetric battlefields can be heavily one-sided to one army depending on the layout of the terrain. It might make narrative sense and look immersive if you created a mission where a guard battalion has to run out of a trench through an empty no man's land to attack a tower encampment. The guard are going to get their teeth propelled out their arsehole via railgun, and the game is going to be really boring to play. Custom rules and homebrew units can be completely overtuned with the justification that it fits with a homebrew lore that you made. Chapter Master Henrius Cavilian of the Ultramarine successor, the Doomslayer Dragon Witcher Superman, is the most badassiest guy ever invented, and his disintegration cannon of hyperdeath does 12, strength 14, AP 3, damage 6 attacks, and his sword of Skullblood Massacre is anti-everything 2+ with devastating wounds, because in the lore, he took that sword from a Khorne demon that was a Voltron made up of other Khorne demons, so of course it's that powerful. Also, he only costs 150 points because his movement characteristics is 5 inches instead of 6 inches due to his mega gravis armor that makes him toughness 9 and 9 wounds. It's narrative. It's meant to be unbalanced and flavorful. That's what my character would do. You might think that this is almost as unbalanced and unfair as this made up straw man I created, but you'd be surprised how close this is to reality. Competitive has its sweat lords, but narrative will always have its edgelords. If you're familiar with D&D, this is your min-maxing, multi-classing, feature-abusing arsehole, and your edgy, loner, chaotic, neutral drow rogue with a dark, mysterious past who steals all the party constantly. In 40k, this is the win-at-all-cost, meta-chasing dickhead, and the everything-cost-a-kitchen-sink, overcomplicated Mary Sue creators. Both players need a chance to be able to craft epic tales. It can't be a one-sided affair. And narrative being unbalanced shouldn't be an excuse to take that agency away from someone or to create something that simply doesn't work in the 40k framework. You can't just fob off legitimate balance issues with some of your narrative things because it is narrative. This is one of the issues I have with Crusade, which can get a bit too much into the win more territory with the upgrade system, where winning gets you more XP and more upgrades, and that means you get further ahead and can win even more and get even more upgrades, and the compensation for that with the Crusade blessings is woefully undertuned. Wow, I can start the game with 2 command points and an extra agenda to try and get XP against my opponent who has 10 extremely powerful upgrades more than me. Wow, that sounds awesome. Thank you so much. I can't wait to hear all about the narrative narrative flavor, I was getting my teeth kicked in by a low-knock knight. And there's one final way that things can become unbalanced, and it's one that I did not see discussed. Skill issues. One player could simply just be a better player of the game and could adapt to whatever situation. They are just better at thinking about how they're going to complete their win condition compared to their opponent. You can add handicaps to that player, but that becomes a tricky balance of trying to find that sweet spot, and it comes at the expense of limiting the kinds of stories you can tell. Or it forces the better player to play in a completely nonsensical way. I imagine most experienced narrative players have solved all of these problems, or are attuned enough with their fellow players that these issues solve themselves over a long enough campaign. But these issues can make or break a narrative, and newer players might end up in situations where the unbalanced scenarios cause someone to just stop having fun, or feeling like they're a punching bag and can't tell their story. Collaborative storytelling requires compromise. That is tricky to do in a game of 40k, where fundamentally you're playing a player versus player wargame. If winning and losing truly wasn't important at all, you lose all that moment-to-moment emergent storytelling that comes from a dice game, and your decision making during the battle to sway the tides are meaningless. The result of the game is not predetermined, and you might not care if you lose, but you're gonna fight like hell to ensure you lose heroically. Unbalanced should not be confused with imbalance, which I think is what people are talking about. People will say that narrative is unbalanced when what they really mean is that you have access to upgrades, equipment, or units that would be completely broken in a formal game. That over-the-top chapter master I mentioned earlier is broken. But if both sides have one of them, that's not really a problem. Then you could just both have fun with something really ridiculously stupid. The scale of the balance internally should be the same between the two players. But a scale with a 5,000-ton dreadnought on each side is still a balanced scale. The pitfall to be careful of here is to ensure that you don't make things so broken it causes the game to fall apart. Yes, if both players have access to a nuke that will destroy the opponent's entire army, that is technically fair, but then it's just a game of who gets the first turn, and that's essentially a coin flip. As a more grounded example, if both of the players have access to a chapter master, like I mentioned earlier, that really over-the-top powerful one, and those chapter masters just wipe the floor with every other unit in the game, you might as well have just done a 1v1 between these two chapter masters, and it does make the game fall apart. Your decision making is no longer really valid, you're just going, where should I aim this really powerful weapon? The framework of 40k means you can only take things so far before it breaks down. You still have to adhere to the rules when setting up your board. For example, you still have to use the same units. You still need a win condition for both players to invest in so that you can actually play a game in a way that is engaging and fulfilling. And here's the big twist. All of what I just said is exactly the same if you flip the mindset switch from narrative to competitive. I'm writing my own custom homebrew detachment rules, and I can fall into the same pitfalls without even having to think of any story. I could play a close fought loss and have it feel epic, and that game can take place in a tournament without any narrative explanation. I can try and create fun new missions to play and make it completely unbalanced, not even have the excuse of it's lore accurate to explain to my opponent why it was okay that I was allowed to decimate his army in 2 battle rounds. All of this boils down to the type of game 40k is: a 1v1 player v player war game. Your mindset determines your attitude towards aspects of that, but stripped down to its core, you are still playing the same game as everyone else. That is the problem with narrative 40k. You can make changes and bend things, but at some point it either stops being narratively fulfilling or stops being a game of 40k. Okay, this is all really hard to explain, and I do apologize if this seems a bit overly complicated or a bit circular. But I do want to be clear that whilst I say this is a problem, that doesn't mean I think you're doing anything wrong. If you're bending the switch in the rules mid-game and you and your opponent agree and have a good time, you can fly off the chart as far as you want, as far as I'm concerned. As long as everyone is having fun, you could turn this game into a game that's nothing like 40k, and that's totally fine. If you create a narrative experience and have overarching lore, fully fleshed out unit names, and epic moments without changing anything about 40k and use mission cards and basic L-shaped terrain layouts, that's also completely valid. I guess my concern is the disconnect between playing a 1v1 game of 40k and having that contend against trying to tell the best story. It's that part there where you don't mind if you lose, but you are still going to try and win. Winning and losing does matter, even if it's just for the story, or for you getting upgrades in Crusade game, having more or less chances of getting battle scars, or simply just more chances of being able to do cool shit. When both players have the same influence over the outcome of the narrative, both players are going to try and do what is best for their side. That is the part of narrative 40k that I'm stuck with. As far out as you want to push your ideas, you're always going to be forced back towards what 40k is designed to do best. And just to be absolutely clear, this happens on the other side as well. As far as you want to push the formal strategic game, 40k is a dice game with cool looking models, and that alone will cause epic moments to occur even if you aren't trying. I won a game recently because in the final round I rolled a 5 for an advance to take an objective with my Centurions. I needed to roll that 5 or it would have been a draw. That is cinematic as hell, and you can craft a narrative around that very easily. 40k will always drag you back towards the center, towards the balance point. And I keep saying the word problem. I keep calling this a problem, but it's not really a problem. I mean, it is, but it also isn't. Okay, that made no sense. I'm losing it a bit. Right, let me rephrase that. I think narrative 40k is fine because the most important thing is that you and your opponent have the same mindset. As long as that mindset matches closely, you'll work it out and you'll be fine. But I have an idea that might help narrative 40k by avoiding any potential disagreements that might arise due to the fact that both players are trying to do what is best for their side. This proposal will make it easier to ensure balance, narrative flow, and facilitate epic moments without having to worry about one player being better than the other. A new way of playing that breaks that 1v1 PvP aspect without breaking the framework of 40k. A DM. Tabletop RPGs are the collaborative storytelling experience, and in my opinion, that is for two reasons. One, it's co-op, so you're collaborating explicitly through the game. Two, there is an arbiter of rules that keeps things in check. Someone who has the power and responsibility to ensure balance and to keep things fun and exciting for everyone. For 40k, making one of the players the DM makes a lot of sense to me. One player designs the mission, creates the story, and proposes it to another player to run through it. The DM telling the story has the power to adjust things on the fly based on data gathered during the game, and the player has a chance to react to surprise events that could change the game that don't need to be explicitly decided beforehand. You can have surprises that change the game suddenly and have more interesting designs that are much more difficult to lay out and plan if both players have to have the same level of information and influence over the game. The DM does not have to let the player win. They could craft a difficult encounter that requires a lot of thought to be victorious and could adjust things to keep the player in the game invested without feeling overwhelmed. If the DM has made something that isn't well balanced, they have the power to adjust things behind the scenes without the player being aware. The DM could set up a set piece that allows for epic moments to be the best decision without having players feel the need to make suboptimal or nonsensical choices for the good of the narrative. Some examples. The DM could have a demon prince appear unexpectedly and challenge the player's captain. The player could decide to do that, or maybe the captain resists the challenge, sticking with their brothers to ensure the demon tide is repelled first. In an even game, that demon prince would either have to be written into the list or plan to appear at a certain point to ensure parity in the mission. But a DM couldn't keep that secret. Tyrians could attack the Votan encampment in waves, with the DM deciding whether the next wave should be bigger or smaller based on how the story is progressing. The DM could throw in surprises like some Deansler constantly appearing inside the base, which makes for a more epic scene as opposed to having to plan that out explicitly and know it's coming. For the guardsmen attacking Tau, you can have it so the player's guardsmen are attacking a smaller group of Tau, and the number of rounds it takes to reach and overrun the Tau base determines how many reinforcements arrive and when. As a DM, you could tell the player exactly that, but you don't have to decide exactly how many reinforcements occur if you take X number of rounds. You can see how the game is going and adjust plans accordingly if what you wrote down is over or under tune. If this had the standard parity of a normal game, you would have to explicitly say how many points of things occur on which battle round. And that could have been a mistake straight away, and you've doomed the game from the get-go. Giving one player the power and responsibility of the DM allows for more interesting mission designs, narrative events, and cinematic opportunities by withholding information from the other player. And reacting to those surprises can elevate 40k narrative to new heights. It takes 40k out of being a 1v1 PvP experience, which requires all information to be presented up front. Is it a perfect solution? Absolutely not. And I don't expect that this is going to be an earth-shattering revelation. I'm certain some people are probably already doing this, but it's not something I've really heard of before. And it's not something I read in any of the comments I got. Also, DMing is fucking difficult. Ask any DM for something like D&D. Hell, ask me. I've made a lot of mistakes and caused many problems, both as a DM and as a player. As a player, I've taken things too far and tried to be dramatic for my character at the expense of the other player's fun. I could do a whole video on that. That is me trying to win for my story at the expense of the other person. That's not collaborative storytelling, which I think is where my problems with 40k are, because that is basically what you do in a PvP game. And as a DM, I've made a lot of mistakes in designing combats, magic items, or stories, and either pivoting or not pivoting has caused even more problems. I once made a combat that lasted 3 sessions, a single combat encounter that lasted 9 hours. I can make a lot of videos about my mistakes while DMing, but whilst it isn't easy, it is so much fun. I've made a lot of mistakes, and being the DM when things go wrong really sucks, but when you do it right, there's nothing like it. With 40k, you actually have an easier time. There's no rules for role-playing and social interactions. It's not like you're exactly going to try and do an insight check on the lictor trying to rip your face off. And the combat is a lot more well-defined and controlled than something like D&D. Your job is to take that narrative to the next level, and being the person running and creating the narrative is extremely fulfilling. And being the player who gets to experience someone else's awesome story is equally exciting. And that relationship between player and DM will give a completely unique experience that you cannot get from what 40k is by default. A competitive game and a narrative game will always feel somewhat similar. You're two players trying to complete an objective through a game of 40k. Whether that objective is hold 1, 2 or more, or it's hold this radio tower until the dropship comes. By giving control to one player, they can create so many more unique experiences without sacrificing the core 40k gameplay. Or maybe I'm completely off the mark on this and I've just been speaking complete bollocks this whole time. That's probably quite likely. The way you play 40k is always valid. Add 40k is played not by any specific type of player when two players of different mindsets and values come into contact. Even within the same quadrants, having areas on the squigs that don't overlap will be a problem. Two competitive players can disagree if one is a win at all costs, no take back scotches kind of player, and two narrative players can disagree if one is trying to inject far too much custom homebrew nonsense. But if that win at all costs guy plays another win at all costs guy, they're gonna have a good game because they understand the expectation and both players agree to it. No takebacks, no rules reminding, gotchas everywhere, but that's what they signed up for, so they won't complain. Probably. What kind of player are you? Do you think my ideas are good? Have I successfully clickbaited you with the title to get you to watch the whole video? Statistically, probably not. Let me know what you think about this 40k DM idea, and if you do try it out or maybe have already tried it out, please let me know your experiences because I'd love to hear them. But in any case, if you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and like, subscribe, all the good YouTube stuff. I have a Twitch channel and a VOD channel you should follow. And if you want to support me even further and help me continue being a full-time YouTube funny man, you can become a member or patron like all of these fine folk. Your support means the world to me and gets you access to the super secret supporters club, where we're trying to craft a real railgun to take narrative 40k to the next level by implementing real-time, realistic battle damage.